In the summer of 1946, a surveyor named Harlan Webb was walking a boundary line through the Tygart Valley in Barbour County, West Virginia. He carried a transit and a chain, and he was looking for a long-forgotten property corner that had been marked on a map from 1872. The land had been bought and sold so many times that no one alive remembered where the original lines had been drawn. The owners wanted it settled. Webb had been working the hills for 20 years. He knew the way the mountains folded in on themselves, the way hollows swallowed the light, the way creeks changed course after every spring flood. He knew that in these woods, you could walk past something 100 times without ever seeing it. But on this particular July afternoon, the undergrowth gave way beneath his boot, and he found himself looking down into a dark hole in the earth. It wasn't a sinkhole. It was a shaft, roughly square, about 6 feet across and 15 feet deep. The sides had been shored up with hand-hewn timbers that were black with age and rot. At the bottom, barely visible through the tangle of leaves and deadfall that had accumulated over the decades, he could see the outline of something made of metal. He lowered himself carefully, finding handholds in the mossy stones. The smell of wet earth and decay filled his nostrils. When he reached the bottom and began to clear away the debris, he found a cast-iron box, about the size of a steamer trunk. It was secured with a heavy padlock that had long since rusted into a solid mass of orange. Webb spent the rest of the day trying to open that box. He tried a pry bar, a sledgehammer, and finally a cold chisel. Nothing worked. Eventually, he did the only thing he could do. He dragged the box out of the hole, loaded it onto his pack mule, and carried it back to his truck. What he found inside the box, when he finally managed to break it open in his workshop that night, changed everything he thought he knew about the hills where he had spent his entire life. The box contained a collection of ledgers, journals, and loose papers, all meticulously handwritten. There were maps. There were letters. There were lists of names, hundreds of them, carefully recorded. And there was a photograph, sepia-toned and slightly faded, showing a group of men standing in a clearing somewhere in the mountains. They were dressed in dark suits and hats, and they looked like they were posing for a portrait. But there was something wrong with the photograph. The men were standing in a circle, and their hands were clasped together. They looked like they were praying. Webb recognized some of the names in the ledgers. They were family names, old mountain names, names that had been in Barbour County for generations. His own family had been in those hills since before the Civil War. He knew these people. Or he thought he did. In the pages of those journals, he found something he had never expected. An organization of men who had been meeting in secret for decades. Men who believed in things that had no place in the modern world. Men who had used the mountains for purposes that had nothing to do with farming or logging or mining. The journals described meetings held on certain nights of the year, in certain places marked on the maps. They described rituals and ceremonies. They described things that Webb, a practical man who had spent his life measuring land and building fences, could not bring himself to believe. But he knew one thing for certain. The box had been hidden in a shaft that was roughly 40 years old, give or take. That meant it had been placed there sometime around 1900. Which meant that whatever was in those pages was not ancient history. It was living memory. In a small town in West Virginia in 1946, a man holding a collection of secret journals had just stumbled onto the story of one of the most carefully concealed conspiracies in Appalachian history. And he had no idea what it would cost him to tell that story. To understand the discovery that Harlan Webb made in that iron box, you have to understand the Appalachian world where it was hidden. The Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia have always been a place apart. The first European settlers arrived in the mid-1700s, mostly Scots-Irish and German families who came down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania. They found a landscape that was both beautiful and brutal, with steep ridges, narrow valleys, and soil so thin you had to blast the rocks out just to plant corn. By the 1850s, the region had developed a distinctive culture, deeply independent, fiercely proud, and suspicious of outsiders. The mountain people had their own ways of doing things, their own laws, their own religion. They worshipped in small country churches, but they also kept older beliefs, folklore, and superstitions that had been passed down through generations. They told stories about witches and ghosts and signs. They planted by the moon. They read omens. They knew things that the people in the cities didn't know and wouldn't understand. The Civil War tore the mountain communities apart. West Virginia split from Virginia and joined the Union, but that didn't mean everyone was on the same side. Family members fought against each other. Bushwhackers roamed the hills, preying on both sides. After the war, the region was left with a legacy of bitterness and violence that lasted for generations. In the years after the war, the secret societies that had been common in the mountains took on a darker significance. The Ku Klux Klan spread through the region in the late 1860s, targeting black residents and Republican supporters. The Mountain State had its own branch of the Klan, and it operated with particular viciousness in the hill counties where law enforcement was almost non-existent. But the men who met in the mountains were not the Klan. They were something else entirely. They were older, more secretive, and their goals had nothing to do with politics or race. At least not directly. By the 1880s, the region was also undergoing a massive transformation. The railroads were pushing into the mountains, bringing coal companies, timber companies, and a new kind of exploitation. The land that mountain families had owned for generations was being bought up, often through fraud and intimidation. The men who organized these land grabs were from outside, from the cities, from the north. They had lawyers and contracts and the backing of the courts. The mountain people fought back in the only way they could. They appealed to their old beliefs. They called on older powers. They kept their secrets in the hills, writing them down in ledgers and hiding them in iron boxes under the ground. The story that Harlan Webb uncovered in 1946 was the story of that secret war. Webb recognized one of the faces in the photograph immediately. It was his great-uncle, Solomon Webb. Sol had been a justice of the peace in Barbour County for 30 years. He had also been a circuit rider, an itinerant preacher who traveled the mountain hollows on horseback, visiting isolated families and holding services in their cabins. Everyone had loved and respected Sol Webb. He had died in 1902, and his funeral had been one of the largest the county had ever seen. In the photograph, Sol was standing in the circle with the other men, his hands clasped, his head slightly bowed. He was surrounded by men from the best families in the county. Planters, lawyers, merchants, and preachers. Men who sat on the boards of banks and churches. Men who helped write the local laws. The ledger that accompanied the photograph had a list of names on the first page. It read like a local telephone directory. There were Webbs, Shore, and Simmons and Davis and Robinson and Jones. But there were also names that Webb knew from the headstones in the cemetery up on the ridge. Names that his mother had told him belonged to the founders of the county. The people who had first settled the Tygart Valley, who had carved farms out of the wilderness, who had built the churches and the schools. At the bottom of the page, someone had written a single line in ink, "The Hill Company." Webb looked at the photograph again. There were 33 men in the circle. 33 of the most powerful men in Barbour County, all standing in a clearing in the woods, their hands clasped, their heads bowed. What were they doing? He turned the page. The second page of the ledger was a list of dates going back to 1845. Under each date, there was a cryptic notation. Full moon. Eclipse. Harvest. Hallows. At the top of the page, a title, The Business of the Company. Webb had grown up in the mountains. He had heard stories about witches and hauntings, of course. Everyone had. But he had never taken them seriously. He was a modern man, a surveyor, a man of facts and figures. He knew how to read a map and measure an acre. He didn't believe in magic. But as he sat in his workshop, reading page after page of the ledger, he began to realize that the men who had written these pages had believed in something. They had believed with a fervor that bordered on desperation. As Webb began to study the ledgers in earnest, a pattern started to emerge. The men of the Hill Company had been holding meetings for more than half a century. They met on specific nights, at specific locations, marked with secret symbols on the maps in the box. The locations were mostly in the deep woods, far from any road or settlement. Some of them were in caves. Some were in the ruins of old structures that Webb had never known existed. The purpose of these meetings, as far as Webb could determine from the cryptic references in the ledgers, was to settle disputes. Not the kind of disputes that were taken to the county courthouse. These were family feuds, land disputes, quarrels over inheritance and honor, and the thousand small grievances that could tear a mountain community apart. The Hill Company, Webb realized, was a secret court. It had been created in the 1840s, at a time when the regular courts were corrupt and unreliable. The men who ran it were the power brokers of the county. They had their own laws, their own punishments, their own ways of doing justice. They operated entirely outside the legal system, making decisions that were enforceable only because of who they were and what they could do to the people who defied them. And their decisions were often brutal. The ledgers mention things like white caps and night riding, terms that Webb knew from old stories his grandmother had told him. The white caps were vigilantes, men who dressed in white hoods and rode through the night, whipping or banishing anyone who stepped out of line. They were supposed to have died out after the Civil War. But according to the ledgers, they had simply merged into the Hill Company, becoming part of a larger, more organized structure. Webb also found references to something called the method. This was the Hill Company's way of investigating crimes and settling disputes. It involved interrogation, sometimes harsh interrogation, and punishments that ranged from fines to whippings to banishment. In extreme cases, the method could also be used for what the ledgers called final discipline. A euphemism for something much darker. The Hill Company did not believe in relying on the authorities. They didn't trust the sheriff, the judges, or the state police. They trusted only themselves, their blood, and the men they had grown up with. In their own minds, they were not criminals. They were the only thing standing between the mountain communities and chaos. It was the mention of witches that first made Webb wonder if he had stumbled onto something much larger than a secret vigilante organization. The ledgers contained references to certain women in the county who were known as cunning women or wise women. These women were consulted for healing, for protection, for the reading of omens. They knew herbs and remedies that the regular doctors didn't know. They could cure a cow of milk fever, they could stop bleeding with a touch, they could tell you if your crops would fail or if your husband was cheating on you. Webb had heard his grandmother talk about such women when he was a boy. She had called them granny women. There had been one in the hollow where he grew up, an old widow named Maria Connor, who had delivered most of the babies in the district and treated everything from toothache to pneumonia with herbs and tinctures and prayers. She had been a legend in her time, beloved by everyone. But the ledgers described a much more complicated relationship between the Hill Company and the Cunning Women. On one page, they mentioned paying a woman named Abigail Crane to unmake a curse that someone had placed on a neighbor's family. On another, they noted that a woman named Millie Ash had been consulted about a property dispute, and her advice had been followed. Some of the women were listed as members of something called the Sisterhood, which appeared to be the female counterpart of the Hill Company. Webb began to understand that the Hill Company and the Cunning Women were two sides of the same coin. The men handled disputes and punishments. The women handled healing and protection. They used different methods, but their purpose was the same: to maintain order in the community and protect the mountain people from outside threats. But there was another, darker side to this arrangement. According to the ledgers, the Hill Company had occasionally used accusations of witchcraft to get rid of people they didn't like. Women who were too independent, who knew too much, who refused to follow the orders of the community elders, could be accused of being witches and subjected to the method. If the accusation stuck, the punishment could be severe, banishment, physical punishment, or worse. Webb read one entry that made his blood run cold. It was from the 1880s, and it mentioned a woman named Rachel Bowers who had been accused of using her healing skills to draw the souls of the children she treated. The Hill Company had investigated, and after applying the method, they had determined that the accusation was unfounded. But the investigation itself, Webb noted, had involved keeping Rachel Bowers in a cave for 3 days, in the cold and the dark, to see if her spirit would break. The Hill Company did not have a legal right to do this. But no one ever told them otherwise. And no one who knew what had happened to Rachel Bowers ever spoke of it again. Webb spent the next several weeks carefully copying the maps that were in the box. They were hand-drawn, beautifully detailed, showing the mountains and valleys of Barbour County with an accuracy that surprised him. The surveyor in him appreciated the skill that had gone into their creation. But it was what the maps marked that truly captured his attention. Dotted across the landscape were dozens of symbols that Webb could not identify. They looked like a mixture of Celtic crosses, astrological symbols, and something else entirely. He cross-referenced these symbols with the dates in the ledger and discovered that each symbol corresponded to a location where the Hill Company had held a meeting. Many of these locations were impossible to find on any modern map. They were in places so remote that even the loggers and coal miners had avoided them. Webb decided he would visit as many of these locations as he could. The first was a cave on a ridge known as Booth's Knob. Webb had passed within a mile of it many times, but he had never noticed anything unusual about the area. When he finally climbed the steep slope and found the entrance, he was astonished. The cave was deep, dry, and had been carefully modified. There were flat stones arranged in a semicircle, like seats. There were niches in the walls where candles or lamps could be placed. In the center of the floor, someone had carved a circle into the limestone. Webb knelt and examined the carving. It was worn, but he could see a pattern of interlocking lines that looked like a Celtic knot. Around the edges of the circle, there were smaller symbols, a moon, a star, a cross, and something that looked like an eye. He knew he was standing in a place where people had once gathered. This was no accidental formation. The Hill Company had been meeting in that cave for decades, maybe longer. On the walls, Webb found more carvings. They were names, mostly. Some were dates. One of the dates was from the 1840s. But there was also a message that made him stop and stare. The company keeps the law of the hills, which no government can break. We are not of them. We are of the mountains. And below that, in smaller letters, someone had written, "Beware the witch who knows the road. She walks at night." Webb wondered what the road referred to. Was it a physical path? Or something else entirely? As he traced the carving with his fingers, the image of a line winding through the forest came to mind, a path that could be traveled by those who knew the secret, a path that belonged to the Hill Company alone. When Webb returned to his workshop that night, he found something that convinced him he was not alone in his investigation. Someone had been in his shop. The door was unlocked. The ledgers were still there, but they had been moved. The maps had been placed on top of them, and they were open to a page that Webb had not looked at before. It showed a section of the county near the headwaters of the Tygart Valley River, with a symbol marked in the center, a circle with a dot in the middle. Had someone come into his workshop to give him a message? Or to warn him away? Webb didn't know. But he was now certain that the Hill Company still existed, still operated, and was aware of his discovery. The implications were clear. Whatever this organization was, it had survived its secrets being buried in that iron box. The people who wrote those ledgers were dead, but their descendants, their sons and grandsons, were still guarding their legacy. Webb had two choices. He could report the ledgers to the authorities and wash his hands of the whole affair. Or he could continue his investigation and see where it led. He chose the latter. His family had lived in Barbour County for more than 100 years. His ancestors had been among the first settlers in the Tygart Valley. If there was a secret history buried in his own blood, he had a right to know it. Webb spent weeks trying to find someone who could tell him more about the Hill Company. His first instinct was to ask his elderly relatives, but he quickly discovered that they didn't want to talk about the subject. When he showed his aunt the list of names from the ledger, she turned pale and said she couldn't remember anything about it. She told him to let the past stay buried. Webb's great-uncle was not so reserved. Silas Webb was 92 years old, blind, and more or less confined to a rocker on his front porch. But his mind was still sharp, and he remembered a great deal about the old days. When Webb described the ledgers to him, Silas nodded slowly. "I knew about the Hill Company," he said. "My daddy was in it. He never talked about it, but I knew." "What did they do?" Silas was quiet for a long time. "They kept the peace," he finally said. "When the law wouldn't do it, the company would. There was a lot of bad things happened in those hills. Murder, theft, people just disappearing. The company would find out who done it, and they'd take care of it." "Take care of it how?" "They'd whip the wrongdoers. Sometimes they'd run them out of the county. Sometimes, if it was bad enough, they'd kill them and hide the body somewhere." Webb felt a chill. Did they have the right to do that? Nobody was going to stop them. The sheriff couldn't keep order in the mountains. Nobody could. So the company did it. They were the law, even if the courts didn't know it. Webb asked his great-uncle about the women. The Cunning Women. The sisterhood. Silas's expression darkened. "I don't talk about them," he said. "It's not lucky. Please, uncle. I need to know." The old man sighed. There were women who knew things. They could heal, they could tell the future. They knew things that wasn't learned in books. The company used them, but they also feared them. Those women had power. Real power. What kind of power? Power over the spirits. Power over the mountains. They could lay a curse on someone, and that person would die. They could protect someone from harm, and nothing would hurt them. The company needed them, but they didn't trust them. That's why the method was so harsh on the women who got accused. The company had to show them who was in charge. Webb learned that the terms witch and cunning woman were often used interchangeably in the mountains, but they didn't mean the same thing. A witch was someone who used her power for evil, who made pacts with the devil, who brought harm and destruction. A cunning woman, on the other hand, worked with the natural world, with herbs and prayers and folk remedies. She was a healer, not a destroyer. But the boundary between the two was blurry. A cunning woman could be accused of being a witch if she angered the wrong person. And once she was accused, the Hill Company would step in. They had their own way of determining guilt and innocence, and it was rarely gentle. Silas told Webb a story about a woman named Callie Parsons, who had lived near the Randolph County line in the 1890s. Callie was a healer, known for her ability to stop bleeding and cure sick livestock. She was also known for having a sharp tongue and a fierce independence, which made her enemies among the more powerful families. One winter, a neighbor's daughter fell ill with a fever that wouldn't break. The neighbor, a man named Asa Farrell, called in Callie to try to save the girl. But despite her best efforts, the girl died. Farrell was grief-stricken and angry, and he blamed Callie. He told people that Callie had deliberately let the girl die, that she was a witch who had used her powers to murder the child. The accusation spread through the community. The Hill Company investigated. According to Silas, the investigation involved keeping Callie in a cellar for several nights, under guard, while the men of the company interrogated her. They demanded she confess to her crimes. "I don't know what happened," Silas said. But the next spring, Callie was gone. Some people said she'd been run out of the county. Others said she was dead. Nobody knew for sure. Webb asked if the Hill Company had ever been punished for what they did. Silas laughed. Punished? By who? The sheriff? The judge? Those men were the judge and jury in this county. You couldn't touch them. If you tried, you'd find yourself on the wrong end of the method. Webb's investigation took a strange turn when he discovered a reference in the ledgers to something called the Night Road. The night road, according to the notes, was a ritual that the Hill Company performed at certain times of the year. It involved a procession through the woods, following a path that was marked with symbols and signs. The purpose of the ritual was to protect the community from outside threats, to ensure good harvests, and to keep the spirits of the mountain satisfied. What Webb found most intriguing was the language used to describe the ritual. It was not the language of Christian prayer, but something older, more elemental. There were references to the old ones, to the hill folk, to the people under the earth. The writers of the ledger seemed to believe that the hills themselves were alive, that there were spirits in the rocks and the trees and the streams, and that these spirits had to be honored if the community was to survive. Webb had heard stories like this before. His grandmother had told him about the haints, the restless spirits that haunted the mountain hollows. She had talked about the little folk who lived in the caves and the mountain devils that showed themselves as mysterious lights in the darkness. But she had always made it sound like folklore, fairy tales to scare children. The ledgers suggested otherwise. The men of the Hill Company had taken these beliefs seriously. They had built their secret court and their justice system on a foundation that was part Christian and part older, more primal. Webb also found references to the Witch's Road, which was apparently a separate but related ritual. The Witch's Road, according to the notes, was a path that could be walked by those who had been given special knowledge. It was a route through the mountains that linked the sacred sites of the Hill Company. Walking it allowed a person to draw on the power of the land, to see things that were hidden, to gain protection from harm. The Witch's Road, in other words, was the magical geography of the region. And the Cunning Women, the sisterhood, were the keepers of its secrets. Webb pulled out the maps and began to trace the lines that connected the various meeting sites. He saw immediately that they did not form a random pattern. They formed a web, a latticework that covered the county. At the center of the web was a point near the headwaters of the Tygart Valley River, the same spot that had been marked on the map that had been left open in his workshop. This was the heart of the Witch's Road, the place where the rituals converged. Someone had left that map open for a reason. Someone had tried to guide him toward the truth. But he also realized that someone could have been trying to lure him deeper into a world he didn't fully understand. The choice was now his: follow the trail, or step back and return to the safe, ordinary life of a surveyor. Webb packed his gear and set out for the headwaters of the Tygart Valley River, a place he had never visited before. It was a remote corner of the county, reachable only by a long hike through the woods. When he arrived at the area marked on the map, he found a clearing that had been maintained. It was not overgrown like the other sites he had visited. The brush had been cut back, the ground was clear. Someone had been keeping the place in order. In the center of the clearing stood a stone marker. It was a rough-hewn block of sandstone, about 4 feet high, with a flat top. Webb noticed that there were carvings on the side of the stone, interlocking patterns, a crescent moon, a star, a cross. The same symbols he had seen in the cave. He examined the base of the marker and found a small cavity, hidden beneath a loose stone. Inside was a leather pouch, wrapped in oilcloth. He opened it carefully and found a stack of papers, covered with the same fine handwriting as the ledgers. These papers were different from the ledgers. They were personal accounts, written in the first person, by someone who had been a member of the Hill Company. The author described his life as a member of the secret organization, the rituals he had participated in, the things he had seen. It was a confession, a diary of guilt and redemption. The author was a man named Elias Dodd. He had been a farmer, a deacon in the local Baptist church, and a respected citizen of Barbour County. He had joined the Hill Company in the 1880s and had served for more than 30 years. Elias wrote that he had been drawn to the company because he believed in the importance of protecting the mountain community. He had seen the law fail too many times, had watched good people suffer at the hands of criminals and corrupt officials. He wanted to make a difference. But as his years in the company accumulated, he had become increasingly uncomfortable with what they were doing. The rituals, the secret meetings, the harsh punishments, it all felt wrong to him. He had joined to protect his community, but he found himself becoming something he never wanted to be. The final entry in Elias's account described his last meeting with the Hill Company. It had taken place during the winter of 1901, at a remote cabin in the woods. At that meeting, the company had decided to punish a man named Stuart Cobb, who had been accused of killing a neighbor's mule. The accusation was a lie, Elias wrote. He knew because he had spoken to the neighbor, who had admitted that the mule had died of natural causes. But someone in the company had a grudge against Cobb, and they wanted him punished. When Elias spoke up for Cobb, he was overruled. The company had voted to apply the method, and Cobb would be whipped and driven from the county. Elias had been horrified. He had left the meeting early, vowing never to return. They have become what they once fought against, Elias wrote. They are the oppressors now. They have forgotten the law of the hills. They have become the devils. Elias had hidden his account in the stone marker, hoping that someone would find it and understand what the company had become. He had died in 1910, never knowing if his words would ever be read. Webb was shaken by the account. Elias had been a good man, a man who had tried to do what was right. But he had been caught up in something larger than himself, something that had corrupted the very ideals he had tried to serve. The Hill Company had not always been a force for good. In the end, it had become a tool for oppression, a secret society that used its power to protect itself and punish its enemies. As Webb continued reading through Elias Dodd's account, he stumbled upon something unexpected, a connection between the Hill Company and the railroad companies that had descended on West Virginia in the late 19th century. According to Elias's diary, the Hill Company had been involved in a much larger conspiracy, one that extended beyond Barbour County. The coal companies and timber companies that had bought up the land had not done so through legal means alone. They had worked with the Hill Company and similar organizations in other counties to intimidate, bribe, and corrupt the people who resisted them. Elias described a meeting that had taken place in 1898, at which representatives of several railroad companies had met with the leaders of the Hill Company. The companies had offered money, favors, and future business dealings in exchange for help in securing the land they wanted. The Hill Company had accepted the offer. They had used their influence and their methods to convince the landowners to sell, often through threats and intimidation. Those who refused had been made to pay a heavy price. Webb found a name in Elias's diary that made him pause. The name was Mr. Earp. Not a member of the Hill Company, but a representative of the railroad. A man who had traveled to Barbour County to negotiate with the secret organization. Webb had heard stories about the Earp family. They were wealthy, connected, and powerful. But he had never imagined they might be involved in something like this. The diary also contained a reference to something called the Conley Contract. This was an agreement, apparently signed in secret, that gave the railroad companies access to certain lands in the Tygart Valley. The contract had never been made public, and Elias wrote that he had never seen the actual document. But he believed it existed, and that it was the key to unlocking the full extent of the conspiracy. Webb began to wonder if the connection to the railroads was the reason the Hill Company had been willing to go to such extremes. The power and money involved were enormous. Perhaps they had been bought off long ago, their original purpose corrupted by greed. Webb's investigation was no longer confined to Barbour County. He began to dig through old newspapers and court records, looking for any mention of the Hill Company or similar organizations. He found references to similar groups in Taylor, Randolph, and Tucker counties. They all had different names, but their methods were the same: secret meetings, harsh punishments, and close connections to the powerful families of the region. He also began to trace the history of the railroad companies that had operated in the region. They had been ruthless in their pursuit of land and resources, and they had often used violent tactics to get what they wanted. Strikes were broken by force. Communities were terrorized. People were killed. The Hill Company had been part of this system. They had been the enforcers, the men who made sure that the coal and timber companies could operate without interference from the local population. In exchange, they had been given money, power, and protection. Webb found something else in the records. A connection between the railroad and the clandestine religious communities that had existed in the hills. These were not the mainstream churches, but small, secretive congregations that met in hidden places, away from the eyes of the authorities. The Hill Company had sometimes used these communities to hide their activities, to move money and goods without being noticed. The conspiracy was not just about land or money. It was about control. The railroad companies wanted to control the resources of the region. The Hill Company wanted to control the people. Together, they had created a system of power that had lasted for decades. Webb also found evidence of a connection between the Hill Company and the legal system. Some of the same men who had been members of the company had also been sheriffs, judges, and lawyers. They had worn the robes of the law while practicing something else entirely in the shadows. There was no one left to answer for what they had done. The men who had run the Hill Company were all dead. But their descendants were still there, still living in the hills, still holding the wealth and power that their ancestors had acquired through violence and corruption. Webb decided that he had to know the full truth, even if it was painful. He returned to the cave on Booth's Knob and searched it more thoroughly. In a crevice hidden behind a loose stone, he found another box, smaller than the first. Inside was a set of letters, written in the 1920s, between two men who had been members of the Hill Company. The letters described a meeting that had taken place in 1921, at which the company had made a decision that would have long-lasting consequences. They had decided to close down the organization, to destroy their records, and to scatter their members. They had done this because they were afraid that the outside world was closing in on them. The coal and timber companies had pulled out, the railroads had cut back, and the federal government was paying more attention to the region. The Hill Company could no longer operate as it once had. But the letters also revealed that not all of the records had been destroyed. Some of the ledgers and documents had been hidden, in the hope that they might be recovered someday if the company was needed again. The men in the letters discussed the possibility of restarting the company if conditions changed. They mentioned younger men, sons and grandsons, who could be brought into the fold. They discussed the need to maintain the old knowledge, the rituals, the secrets. Webb realized that the Hill Company had not simply died out. It had gone underground, waiting for a time when it could emerge again. The box that Webb had found in the shaft had been hidden in 1900, at a time when the company was still active. But the letters from the 1920s showed that the company had continued to operate, even if in a reduced capacity. The families that had been involved had passed the tradition down to their children. The Hill Company could be alive and well in the hills of West Virginia. And Webb had been poking into its history. Webb's discovery of the letters sparked another, more immediate concern. He was being watched. He first noticed it when he returned from the cave. His truck had been moved. It was sitting at a different angle from where he had left it, and the front tire was deflated. It could have been a coincidence, but Webb didn't believe in coincidences. Then, a few days later, he found a note stuck under his door. It was written on a piece of cheap paper, in block letters, "Stop digging. You don't want to meet the company." Webb didn't take the warning seriously at first. He was too deep into the investigation to stop. But then his workshop was broken into. The ledgers and maps were still there, but some of his personal papers had been disturbed. He couldn't prove that anything had been taken, but he was sure someone had been looking for something. He told his wife about the break-in. She was frightened and urged him to go to the police. Webb considered it, but he knew that the police in Barbour County were the sons and grandsons of the men who had run the Hill Company. They might be part of the conspiracy themselves. He also considered leaving the county. But he had lived in the hills his entire life. He couldn't imagine leaving. And he was determined to see his investigation through to the end. Webb began to carry a gun with him wherever he went. He stopped walking in the woods alone. He told a few trusted friends what he had found, swearing them to secrecy. But he had no idea who to trust. The Hill Company's reach was long, and its methods were ruthless. The threats escalated. Webb received more notes, each more menacing than the last. One was slipped under his door in the middle of the night, a single sentence written in red ink: "The company knows what you found. The company knows where you live." Webb's wife pleaded with him to stop his investigation. His children, who had heard rumors of what their father was doing, begged him to leave the county. But Webb was not easily intimidated. He had grown up in the mountains, had learned to stand his ground against bullies and thieves. He wasn't going to let a secret society scare him off. He went to the County Historical Society and asked if they had any records of the Hill Company. The archivist, a retired schoolteacher named Elroy Simmons, looked at him with a strange expression. "You've been asking a lot of questions," Simmons said. "People are talking." "Let them talk," Webb replied. "I just want to know the truth." Simmons was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You might not like what you find. Some secrets are better left buried." When Webb pressed him, Simmons refused to say anything more. He ended the conversation by telling Webb, "If you value your life, you'll stop asking questions." Webb left the Historical Society, shaken. Simmons had always seemed like a mild, harmless man. But there was something in his eyes that was cold, something that had made Webb feel like he was being judged. The threat was real. The Hill Company had reach and influence that extended well beyond the criminals and vigilantes. It was part of the fabric of the community, woven into its history and its politics. To challenge it was to challenge the entire structure of power in Barbour County. Webb's fortunes changed when he met a woman named Margaret Kiblinger. Margaret was an elderly widow who lived in a small house near the county line. She had been born in the Tygart Valley and had spent her entire life there. She knew more about the history of the region than anyone else, because she had lived through much of it. Her grandfather had been a member of the Hill Company, and her father had known its secrets. Margaret had heard about Webb's investigation, and she had decided to help him. She saw the discovery of the ledgers and maps as a chance to finally bring the truth of the Hill Company to light. She had been waiting for someone like Webb to come along. "I can tell you what you need to know," she said, "but you won't like it. The Hill Company wasn't just a bunch of thugs. It was a system, a way of doing things that had been in place for generations. It was how the families in this region kept control of everything. They had their own courts, their own laws, their own way of settling disputes." Margaret described the two parallel systems that had governed the region. There was the official system, with its sheriffs and judges and courtrooms. And there was the hidden system, the Hill Company, which operated in the shadows. The two systems were linked, with the same men holding power in both. When someone was brought before the company, Margaret said, they could expect to face their accusers and defend themselves. It wasn't fair by the standards of a regular court, but the company felt it was serving a higher purpose. They believed they were protecting the community from outsiders, from corruption, from everything that threatened their way of life. And they were usually right. The regular courts were often bought and paid for, and they didn't care about the mountains. The company did care, even if they went about it the wrong way. Margaret gave Webb a name, Solomon Gibson. He had been one of the most powerful members of the Hill Company, a man who had controlled the county's economy and politics for decades. Gibson had been a merchant, a landowner, and a politician. He was also a ruthless man who had used the company's methods to destroy his enemies. There was something else, Margaret said. The company had a secret file. They kept it in a bank vault in the town of Philippi. That file contained everything, the records of their meetings, the names of their members, the details of their activities. When the company decided to go underground in the 1920s, they didn't destroy that file. They hid it. I don't know where, but I know it still exists. If you can find it, you'll know everything. Webb was speechless. The file was the key to the whole mystery. If he could find it, he could expose the Hill Company for what it truly was. But Margaret warned him, they will try to stop you. They have people everywhere, people you would never suspect. Be careful. Webb's investigation took on a new urgency after he discovered a faded note in the back of one of the ledgers. It was a list of names and dates, with notes written in an old hand. One entry stood out: the company recognizes that the law is not always right. When the law fails, the company must act. The ultimate authority is not found in any courthouse. It is in the hills themselves. Webb began to piece together the full extent of the conspiracy. The Hill Company had not just been a vigilante group. It had been a secret government, a parallel system that had existed alongside the official one for more than a century. It had its own courts, its own police, its own punishments. And it had been remarkably successful at maintaining control over the mountain communities, even as the outside world changed around them. The final piece of the puzzle was the file in the bank vault. Webb knew he had to get to it before the company could destroy it. He contacted a lawyer in Charleston, a man named Daniel Hardin, who had a reputation for taking on controversial cases. Hardin agreed to help Webb secure the records and make them public. But the lawyer warned Webb that the Hill Company had friends in high places. The legal battle could be long and difficult. Webb also received a final warning, one that he could not ignore. His daughter came home from school in tears, clutching a note that had been pinned to her backpack. "Your father is digging into things that don't concern him. If he doesn't stop, something will happen to him. And perhaps to you." Webb realized that the Hill Company would stop at nothing to keep its secrets. They had already proven that they had no compunction about threatening children. They would not hesitate to use violence if they felt the need. Webb decided to force a confrontation. He called a meeting with the known leaders of the Hill Company's descendants, men who held positions of power in the county. He told them, via a letter delivered by a trusted friend, that he knew everything and that he was going public with the story. He gave them a deadline. If they didn't release the file in the bank vault, he would go to the press and the authorities with everything he knew. The response came quickly. A man named Jebediah Webb, a distant cousin of Harlan's, and one of the most powerful figures in the county, showed up at his door. "You don't know what you're doing," Jebediah said. "The company wasn't what you think. It was a way of keeping order. Without it, this county would have been a battleground. You're going to tear everything apart." "Then release the file," Webb said. "Let the people see what the company really did." Jebediah shook his head. "You don't understand. The things in that file would destroy families. It would tear the community apart. Some things are better left buried." "You're saying that to protect yourselves." "I'm saying it to protect everyone. Yes, there were things that happened, bad things, that the company was responsible for. But we've moved on from that. We're not the same people. We don't do those things anymore. Let the past stay buried." Webb was silent. He knew that Jebediah was telling the truth about one thing: the Hill Company had changed. The organization that had existed in the 19th century was no longer the same one that operated in the present day. But the secrets of the past had not been fully revealed. "Tell me where the file is," Webb said. "I'll see to it that the truth comes out in a way that won't destroy the county." Jebediah looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "It's in a vault in the Philippi Bank. But it's sealed. I don't know the combination." Webb knew he was being told a partial truth. The file was in the bank, but it was protected. He had to find a way to open it without the Hill Company's cooperation. Webb spent the next week trying to get access to the vault. He talked to the bank manager, who refused to cooperate without a court order. He talked to his lawyer, who said that obtaining a court order would take months. He talked to the sheriff, who told him to stay out of trouble. And then something happened that changed everything. The bank manager was found dead in his home. The death was ruled a suicide, but Webb knew better. He knew that the Hill Company had killed the man to prevent him from opening the vault. Webb went to the sheriff, this time with a much stronger determination. "I have evidence that the Hill Company is still operating," he said. they killed the bank manager to protect their secrets. You need to do something. The sheriff was skeptical. But when Webb showed him the ledgers and the letters, his expression changed. I'll have to investigate this, he said. Webb knew that the sheriff would likely do nothing. But he had planted a seed. The Hill Company could no longer operate in complete secrecy. He also went to the county prosecuting attorney, a man named Elmer Thurston. Thurston listened to Webb's story with growing alarm. I've heard rumors about these people, he said, but I never thought it was true. If they're still operating, we need to shut them down. Thurston agreed to petition the court for a warrant to open the bank vault. The legal process was set in motion. The court order was obtained. Webb, Thurston, and the sheriff went to the Philippi Bank and opened the vault. Inside, they found file cabinets filled with documents, all carefully organized and indexed. There were membership lists, minutes of meetings, records of investigations, and details of punishments. The company had kept meticulous records of its activities for almost 100 years. Webb began to go through the files, his hands shaking. He found lists of people who had been tried by the company, detailed accounts of their offenses and punishments. He found records of property disputes, land sales, and financial transactions. He found references to the involvement of the railroad and the coal companies. But the most shocking discovery was in the back of the vault, in a sealed box marked The Witch's Road. Inside, Webb found a series of journals kept by the women of the sisterhood. They were written in a code that took Webb weeks to decipher. When he finally cracked it, he found something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the Hill Company. The sisterhood had been the real power behind the company. They had controlled its finances, its rituals, and its decisions. The men who sat in judgment were merely the public face of the organization. The women had been the puppet masters, manipulating the company for their own purposes. The journals also revealed the secret purpose of the Witch's Road. It was not just a mystical path, but a system of communication and intelligence gathering. The cunning women of the sisterhood used it to share information about the company, to monitor the activities of the men, and to make sure that the company served their interests. The code of the sisterhood was a set of rules that governed the actions of the women. It emphasized secrecy, loyalty, and the protection of the community. But it also allowed for the use of violence when necessary. The Witch's Road, Webb realized, was the true secret of the Appalachian Mountains. The Hill Company had been the mask, the sisterhood the face behind it. The women had controlled everything from the shadows, using the men to carry out their will. Webb published his findings in a series of articles in the county newspaper. The response was immediate and intense. Some people praised him for revealing the truth. Others denounced him as a troublemaker. A few threatened his life. The Hill Company's existence was now public knowledge. The descendants of its members were shamed and embarrassed. Some families were torn apart by the revelations. Others closed ranks and refused to talk about the past. Webb was called to testify before a grand jury in Charleston. He spent days recounting his investigation and showing the evidence he had uncovered. The grand jury issued a report condemning the Hill Company and its activities. But no one was ever prosecuted. The statute of limitations had long since expired for most of the crimes. And the men who had committed them were all dead. Webb had accomplished what he had set out to do. He had uncovered the truth about the Hill Company and the sisterhood. But he had also stirred up a hornet's nest of anger and resentment. He was shunned by many of his neighbors. His children were taunted at school. His wife, unable to bear the pressure, left him. Webb's life had been consumed by the investigation. He had lost his family, his friends, and his peace of mind. And for what? To reveal a secret that had been hidden for more than a century? To expose a conspiracy that no one could punish? He often wondered if he had done the right thing. The truth was important, but was it worth the cost? He had no answer. In the years after the investigation, Webb tried to put his life back together. He returned to surveying, to the quiet work of measuring land and running boundaries. He rebuilt his workshop. He tried to reconnect with his children. But the past never really left him. He still thought about the Hill Company, about the men in the photograph, about the women of the sisterhood. He still wondered if the company had truly disbanded, or if it had merely gone deeper underground, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. He still had the iron box. He had donated most of its contents to the County Historical Society, but he had kept a few items for himself. They were the last reminders of a time when secrets ruled the hills. Webb continued to visit the cave on Booth's Knob. He went there on the anniversaries of the rituals he had discovered in the ledgers. He would sit in the darkness, listening to the silence, and think about the men and women who had come before him. They had believed in something, even if they were wrong. They had tried to create a better world, even if their methods were flawed. And Webb, who had spent his life measuring the land and recording its boundaries, realized that he, too, was part of the same story. He was a product of the mountains, a descendant of the people who had carved their lives out of the wilderness. They had passed their secrets down to him, and he had been the one to reveal them to the world. Webb died in 1967, at the age of 63. He had never remarried. He had never returned to public life. He had spent his final years in quiet contemplation, tending his garden and walking the hills he had known since childhood. His death was not accompanied by any new revelations. He had told his story, and that was enough. But the mystery of the Hill Company and the sisterhood remained. The files he had uncovered were incomplete. Some of the most important records had been destroyed before the vault was opened. And the Witch's Road still remained unmapped, its secrets still hidden in the mountains. In his will, Webb left the iron box to the County Historical Society, along with a letter explaining his investigation and his conclusions. The letter concluded with the words he had found carved into the wall of the cave. Some secrets are not meant to be found. But the search for truth is the only thing that gives meaning to life. The people who had known Webb's story struggled to understand what he had uncovered. Some believed he was a hero, a man who had stood up to a corrupt and powerful organization. Others believed he was a meddler, a man who had disturbed things that were better left buried. But one thing was certain: Harlan Webb's investigation had uncovered a hidden truth about the Appalachian Mountains. The Hill Company had existed, and its influence had touched the lives of everyone in the region. The secrets of the Witch's Road were real, and the men and women who had followed that path had left their mark on the landscape. And there was no one left to deny it. The ending poses a haunting question: how many other such societies still exist, hidden in the shadows, controlling the lives of those who live in the mountains? And who will be the one to discover their secrets?